Impact by 2030. Today, we'll be hearing from speakers from all different backgrounds, from different areas of expertise, and we'll be focusing all around the intersection of housing and climate, two areas that we're pretty excited about at Build Change. So we'll be hearing from my own colleague, Build Change's founder and CEO, Dr. Elizabeth Housler, on Build Change's newest initiative, the Climate Resilient Housing Initiative, which builds on our decades of experience supporting governments and investors to shape housing systems. We will also be hearing from the UN High-Level Champions team, represented by Marcia Toledo, as they're off the heels of an important announcement around climate and housing. And we'll be joined by a roundtable of speakers who I am thrilled that we are welcoming today. They include Rand Reinhard from the state of South Carolina's Office of Resilience, who'll be talking about what they've been doing in the first few years of operations of their office with climate vulnerable communities. We'll be hearing from Jonathan Dewin from the UN Environment Program, who has been championing partnerships and alliances in the construction and building sector. And from Omid Saberi from the International Finance Corporation. So Omid has been at the forefront of IFC's market-based approaches to resilience, as well as the Building Resilience Index. We have a jam-packed agenda, but we do want to hear from you. We want you to share with us your strong policy solutions, your ambitious plans, and case studies of who is championing innovation in disaster and climate resilient housing. Unfortunately, we won't have time for Q&A today because our agenda is so jam-packed. So please drop them in the chat. We're excited to hear about what you're bringing to the table, and we'll record all of the responses that you share with us via chat. So to kick off this sharing, we'd love to highlight a publication that we launched last year at Build Change, which serves as a resource for governments and practitioners to chart a path towards resilient housing. This is the Build Change Guide to Resilient Housing. We will drop this in the chat, and we hope that you find it useful as you assess where your organization can plug into advanced housing solutions worldwide. So with that, I'd love to pass it along to my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Housler, to kick off our discussion today.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Monica. Hi, everyone. Am I good? Are you hearing me?
Good.
Excellent. So we are so excited to have this 1 hour to spend with you on resilient housing. It's such an urgent issue right now all across the world. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Housler. I'm the founder and CEO of Build Change. I want to recognize that we are on the heels of some devastating windstorms, Hurricanes Ian and Fiona in the Western Hemisphere and Typhoon Noru in the Pacific. And both of these have caused loss of life and loss of houses. So there's certainly a heavy amount of urgency, as well as empathy for our colleagues, friends, and families who have been affected by these disasters. So this conversation is coming at a pivotal moment in the issue of housing in the climate sector, as where there are challenges and devastation, there's also an opportunity. At Climate Week last month, the High-Level Champions launched its Breakthrough Agenda, which has been the biggest recognition that we're aware of housing's role in climate action. I'm sure we'll be hearing about this shortly from our colleagues, and as we're gearing up to further action and progress around COP27 and beyond. So this event, we're talking about driving policy action, right? But really it's about people. That's what it comes down to ultimately with all of Build Change's activities, and whenever we're talking about housing. I want to keep that in mind today, because for us at Build Change, the people living in vulnerable housing and eventually living in better climate resilient housing, the people affected most by the impacts of climate change, the people who are counting on the international, national, local communities to make the changes to ensure that they have a place called home. This is who we are talking about and thinking about today. But we're not going to reach scale unless we can change policy, unless we can influence policy, unless we can drive policy action and financing toward disaster resilient housing. So we must ensure that policy incentivizes investment in vulnerable and marginalized communities to have access to disaster resilient housing for everyone, and that those investments continue to shape equitable, accountable policies that work for everyone. So as many of you here know, we launched the Climate Resilient Housing Initiative as part of the Race to Resilience last COP26. We're aiming to drive policy action, channel investment, and build partnerships to make 10 million people more climate resilient by 2030 through better housing. Through this initiative, we're showcasing and championing projects, not just our own, but yours as well, that are delivering housing solutions so that those can be replicated in other locations. That is the key: replication, and scale. So please share your policy initiatives, your housing projects, so that we can showcase them and talk about them in future events, just like this on our website, in upcoming meetings, those sorts of things. Because again, we want to share these great ideas that you're already implementing with other stakeholders and partners. So let me share one, Plan Terrazas, we've been supporting in Colombia, led by the city of Bogota. This is recognizing and improving self-built neighborhoods in Bogota by adding second stories, strengthening ground floors. It encourages densification, which can be done at a lower carbon footprint than building an entirely new house. It includes and encourages sustainable growth of these communities. It's also been meeting people where they are, which is a fundamental element of how Build Change approaches things, recognizing the work that has been invested in existing housing and upgrading and strengthening those buildings, helping those homeowners to save the asset that they've already invested in, to protect it, and to build a more sustainable future. So with Plan Terrazas, the city of Bogota and its partners, and I'm happy to say that has included us, has demonstrated that the concept of structural improvement of vulnerable housing can be done at scale. It is possible from technical, financial, and legal point of view. This is just one example of an important and pioneering initiative. I'm happy to hear many more examples from my colleagues today, which is very exciting. So if you are interested in being part of this campaign toward progress and a more resilient future, please join us in the Climate Resilient Housing Initiative. Help us showcase your work and your projects, your initiatives, your partnerships with other governments. My colleague Amy has provided a link to Plan Terrazas in the chat, and we'll also be sharing how to join us to learn more about how to work with us on the Climate Resilient Housing Initiative. Okay, so now I am so thrilled to welcome one of the Climate Resilient Housing Initiative's greatest advocates and partners, Marcia Toledo Sotillo of the UN High-Level Champions for Climate, to discuss this critical importance of resilience and adaptation in our global climate action, and how the Race to Resilience is aiming to achieve this in the housing sector. Marcia, we'd love to hear from you on how we accelerate climate adaptation towards resilience in the housing sector, and how are the high-level champions supporting radical collaboration across the housing sector. Thanks, Marcia.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation, and it's fantastic to be here today. So very much excited to share a few ideas, as well elevate and share what are we doing in this important time to elevate action and accelerate implementation of those solutions that can help us address the challenges that you very much refer to, that are very sensitive. So I don't know, probably start to say, following what you refer at the beginning of your introduction, is critical to recognize climate change is happening now and impacting lives, economies, and the ecosystems we live and require. And in that sense, this housing sector is critical for identifying solutions that are not only relevant for a, let's say, a specific time, but also a longer time, and identifying as well how it can be integrating mitigation and adaptation together, options that are relevant together. So perhaps to recognize the severe impacts that have been evident in the last news, and recognizing that the effects and the compound impacts are happening across time in an increasing frequency and occurrence, we require not only attention to deliver mitigation responses, but urgently adaptation and resilient actions, so that we can prepare and prevent and avoid more impacts socially, economically, and also as well ecosystems that require the provided services for us. To accelerate action on adaptation and resilience, we're working at the level of the campaign, especially to mobilize actors to support, to identify the leadership, their solutions. And we require, in this sense, a variety of actors that can deliver and contribute to this. So to make communities and buildings that we live in and the infrastructure that are needed for housing, whether new or already existing, the most resilient that can be for future climate shocks. So here is critical. How do we identify the vulnerabilities that we have? How do we understand those vulnerabilities, and how we are also identifying opportunities for members, different actors to play a role and to perhaps provide contributions with innovation in technology or in materials, or identify ways that we can cope by using nature that can help as well provide multiple services, multiple benefits, not only in the physical aspect, but also on the benefits at the level of the people that rely and they live in those housing settlements. So perhaps a key that to share at the level of the climate champions is we have put the people at the center of our resilient priority. So we identified a goal of 4 billion people by 2030. And through the campaign, we aim to catalyze action to congregate a series of different initiatives, alliances and coalitions that are advancing different programs, especially on resilient housing, so that we can actually translate what are those adaptation solutions that can help us have a more climate-proof infrastructure, or that can help us translate the nature-based solutions that are incorporated into the green or gray infrastructure that has been incorporated. And that what it means that in regards of people, because at the end of the day, who requires adaptation are people. So bringing people at the center of all those solutions is critical. And how do we translate and we understand as well the opportunity for accessing of those solutions, for participating in those solutions, or for having opportunities as well, because there is funding or allocations of resources that can increase their agency or accelerate the implementation and uptake of those solutions. So it's also those multi-dimensions. And when we were thinking about all of those dimensions, we recognize that it's difficult to just say adaptation is just around one variable. No, it is not the same as greenhouse gas emissions, where we have all, let's say, a transformation pathway. We understand we need to decarbonize. In adaptation and resilience, we need to understand that system interventions are critical. So we developed this year more, let's say, an agenda, so that we can not only catalyze action and bring and congregate and stimulate the different actors relevant for different sectors, including housing, but also we thought about an agenda that can help us make adaptation and resilience more tangible and more manageable, because there are many solutions that are relevant as system interventions, and we are not just talking about one specific variable. So we started to think about how we can define and capture, because we are not inventing this or defining it ourselves alone. It's more, how can we better articulate an agenda of already existing efforts, commitments, and let's say targets or challenges that different groups are already working on, and how we better reflect it and represent it and elevate it. And that is the agenda on the adaptation and resilience breakthroughs that we were able to start. It is not finalized. It is a process. And in that process, we were able to identify a few that can help us put on the table and expand a discussion and engage the actors at the level that we need to further say, hey, we have an agenda of system transformation for adaptation and resilience. It is tangible. It is an opportunity as well to identify how we gather more action, how we gather more investments, how we identify bottlenecks. Are the bottlenecks at the level of the policy? Are the bottlenecks at the level of governance systems or in technology? And by having this agenda, we can also recognize that it's more connected to drive more action and reflect more implementation, and also help communities and actors to feel that their work can be reflected, and there is a sense of direction. Maybe perhaps that's an easier way to explain it. It is a process. It is not an agenda that is finalized. So my intention in this brief, let's say, description of this process is to also say we're so seeking for different cases and stories and identifying how we can enrich that process. We're so interested to identify if the few that we've been able to craft with the inputs that we've had so far are sufficient. Should we broaden and have other breakthroughs that can help us say what needs to happen by 2030 in regards of resilient housing, in regards of safety net or resilient also social systems that rely on housing? How do we address other challenges that are relevant for the broader ecosystems, understanding that housing is relevant across many different, let's say, sectors and fields? No? How do we better reflect and foster for opportunities for the sector to thrive? So my interest as well today is to say, we're very happy that we have received support and inputs. We are not there yet where we should probably be. We really look forward to engage others, have an opportunity to further refine. But most importantly, this is not an agenda that we are going to carry. We are seeking actually that this is an agenda that can help you address, mobilize your action, deliver, and further scale and accelerate the solutions that you have at hand. So happy to share my email. Happy as well to share the Race to Resilience campaign website, and looking forward to continue engaging with you and learning, and of course as well elevate and connect with the work that you do. So thank you, Elizabeth, for this.
Thank you so much, Marcia. That was fantastic. I'm just so delighted that housing is a bigger part of the climate change adaptation agenda. Thank you so much for putting it on the breakthrough agenda. It's just fantastic. I have been saying that we need to drive to net zero, but we can't wait to get there before we make our housing stock more resilient, right? So, and windstorms are going to continue to happen, fires, floods. So we've got to invest in better housing. So thank you so much for making this part of the agenda and driving it forward. I also really appreciate your acknowledgement about how many actors there are involved in this. In housing alone, there's so many different stakeholders. There's government and government at different levels doing building codes, implementing social housing programs, implementing emergency response initiatives. There's technical issues, technical from design, from construction, from technical platforms. There's financing issues. There's the people themselves. There's engagement of the local private sector. There's so many stakeholders involved in producing an environment that makes housing, decent housing available for everyone. That I really appreciate your acknowledgement of so many actors. So we've got some of them on in our next roundtable. I'm delighted to say. So it does take a lot of people to make this happen. We've made some attempt at mapping out the stakeholders in our Build Change Guide to Resilient Housing that was in the chat earlier. So I encourage you all to take a look at that and then share it with us where we've forgot someone or some entity or something like that, or if it's useful. So again, I'm really excited to be able to transition to the next part of our discussion as well, which is a roundtable discussion to bring in some of those stakeholder voices. I'm thrilled to bring to our virtual stage our panelists who my colleague Monica introduced already. So we have Jonathan Dewan from UNEP, Ran Reinhold from the South Carolina Office of Resilience, and Omid Saberi from the International Finance Corporation. So welcome again, Jonathan, Ran, and Omid. It's great to see you all. Thanks for joining us. So we've got a few questions around some of these biggest issues surrounding resilience and building and housing. So let's jump in. But the first one is just kind of tell us what you've been up to. What's your organization doing to advance climate action in the housing sector? What are the goals that you've set for 2020, 2030 or beyond? And what gaps do you see in achieving broader impact? Jonathan, let's start with you. I know you're engaged in UNEP's work as an entity working on sustainability broadly, but also on UNEP's Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. So Jonathan, great to hear from you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So yeah, I'm actually responsible for our buildings and construction portfolio here in UNEP. And I would say, I think our kind of global, I would say, guide is the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which is the major initiative, at least on the UNEP side, that we've been pushing for the last few years, and which has been looking at bringing the whole community from the buildings and construction together, specifically, I would say, in the context of the climate change negotiations, with a view to bring the building sector higher on the agenda, because it was one of, I would say, the maybe not a forgotten element, but one that didn't receive the attention that it would require. Especially, of course, initially this whole discussion started with emissions, because the building and construction sector is, about 37% of energy-related emissions. So it's a quite big part. And the alliance was started with the government of France at COP21. And since when we started, some of the countries that joined, and one of the first countries that joined was actually Morocco. And Morocco, of course, said like, well, mitigation is important, but adaptation also. And adaptation, I think, is a very important element, especially for a lot of the, I would say, maybe more global South countries, even though it is an important topic also for, like, I would say, global North countries, if you want. But on the global North, we are the ones who are making most of the emissions. In most of the global South countries, the emissions are rather limited, or a small fraction of the emissions, and they are not the ones who need to do most work on mitigation, maybe in terms of mitigating future emissions, because they are not yet emitting that much, and with growth, and this might change. But it's more looking at the whole adaptation agenda, because they are the ones who are also hit, I think, more strongly by all these extreme weather events, or even the changing temperatures, even if they also happen on our side of the world. But what we are pushing overall is to achieve, let's say, a zero emission carbon sector, but then also at the same time a resource efficient, because resources also is one of the key issues in the building sector. And then, of course, a resilient building sector, because we know climates are changing, as we mentioned, and we should start building with having the idea that our buildings need to be fit for the future climates also, and need to be resilient in that context specifically. So we have, I would say, two major things that we have been bringing out. One that was actually developed under the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction was a call for action for adaptation in buildings and construction. And that call for action is actually a pretty big publication that sets really the problem, and then points at some of the key actors in the whole value chain, and about what they need to do, and what are some of the tools that they actually can use, or that they should use to implement the actions that are necessary. And so that's one of the major documents that was put forward under the Global ABC specifically. But when you look at this document, it's very much turned towards, I would say, the more formal, part of engineered buildings, and the part that we know, of course, that if you look at buildings and construction, well, first of all, probably about 70% are residential buildings, so we can say housing. So a big part is actually related to housing. And when we look at housing, there's a lot of self-construction, there's a lot of informal construction. And so that part, having a guide that talks more towards the engineers, the procurement and all that is not really helping this whole part of the sector that is out there. And so in UNEP, we also issued a practical guideline, which was trying to at least indicate what are some of the low-cost type of solutions that are out there, that every project that looks more at housing specifically, and especially about working with communities on, reconstruction projects or those type of things, what are some of the elements that they could, first of all, what should they think about when they think about the project? So you need to think about your climate zone, you need to think about, your orientation, about your design, a number of things. So we have actually been putting forward some of those solutions in that publication also, which is then more geared towards this, I would say, more informal or housing sector, and looking a lot also at like the issue of reconstruction after some extreme weather events. So, and then maybe just to say, our goals, or I would say, are basically aligned with the vision that we put forward under the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, but also with the goals of the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, and more specifically, I would say the housing pathway or the human settlements pathway, sorry, that was put forward last year at the COP. So that's basically what puts the vision forward, and in that integrates specifically the issue of resilience. So I'll stop here for my first question and hand over to my colleagues.
Yes, that's fantastic. So we've got that Global ABC Roadmap link in the chat, and we're happy to put the link for the reconstruction guide you were talking about now. That sounds like a really interesting resource, and also happy to put that on the Climate Resilient Housing Initiative website. Yeah, some really fantastic things here, and I appreciate your acknowledgement about how much of the building stock is actually housing, right? I mean, we can't get away with improving infrastructure without addressing housing as well. So thanks very much for that, Jonathan. Ran, you're at such an interesting position in this intersection between disaster response and resilience. So tell us about your work in South Carolina.
So South Carolina Office of Resilience actually what got spawned out of in 2015. We got hit by a 1,000-year flood. We had not been impacted by a hurricane for 26 years. And since that 2015, we recently were hit by Hurricane Ian, not severely, nowhere near like Florida, but that is the fourth hurricane that's landed in less than 7 years. And we've had 2 or 3 near misses as well. So something is definitely changed in the climate because we've never seen this many hurricanes this often. And so that caused our office to be created. We were born out of disaster recovery, purely housing focused. It turns out that the people that are the least likely to run away from disasters are also the least likely to be able to recover on their own from disasters. And the biggest thing, it revolves around housing. So our housing program and our disaster recovery program is low to moderate income focused on the most socially vulnerable people because they're not going to recover themselves. And one of the problems is they did not have very resilient houses. They were not maintained well. And so when the wind and the rain came and the floods, those houses disappeared or broke up pretty badly. We also are we do mitigation to try to get ahead of that. We've got some money and some programs that are trying to do infrastructure things, as well as buying out people that live too close to the water or perpetually being flooded. And probably what I think we're most proud of is we were tasked to create a statewide resilience plan. And as part of that statewide resilience plan, because there's a lot of great actors in South Carolina, a lot of stakeholders who are doing resilient stuff, but it's not really a coordinated effort. And so part of that resilience plan is to kind of focus and coordinate those efforts across the state so that we can collaborate and get some synergy on all those things we're doing so that we can guide that mitigation to prevent future disasters, and as well as have a coordinated recovery. I think the 2 big things that are going to come out of that resilience plan that kind of tie back to what I do in the disaster side is, first off, I've got to get local municipalities to do better zoning. Don't let people build houses where it floods and where water is going to rise up and do bad things to them. And so if we can get some better zoning, and I'll give you, for instance, I'm doing a buyout in a county that's near the coast. And right around the corner, they just authorized like 300 to 400 homes to be built. It's in the same floodplain. So, we just got to be smart about that. And the second thing, and this kind of goes back to what some of the other speakers have said is, look, let's just build houses smarter. A little investment in building a more resilient home up front. Yes, there's an increased cost in doing, better materials, better elevation, but you get a greater return on the far end. But if I take a home, a lot in South Carolina, we like to do slab on grade, right on the ground homes. If I take it up 2 to 3 feet, it's going to cut my flood insurance anywhere from half to 3/4. If I build better now, less likely that I'm going to have the government help to rebuild my home, because if my home is built resilient, I've got a strong roof, I am less likely to have it blow apart when the winds, get up to tropical force or hurricane levels, and then the rain won't penetrate my home, and I might lose a little siding, I might lose a shingle or two, but I'm not going to have the rain, get inside, do the damage. If I'm elevated, I may not get much flooding. And if we can have those better building codes, then I think we could prevent some of the long-term dollars from taxpayers that are needed to do the recoveries. So realistically, we know that if I put $1 into mitigation against flooding, I get about a $7 return. I think if I put $1 into building a better, more resilient house, which is a little more expensive up front, I'm probably going to get a $10 or $12 return on the back end when I don't have to have the federal government rebuild my home. So yeah, that's kind of what we're doing here.
Yeah, it's super fantastic. There's small things that can be done to make the buildings better, but then there's also bigger issues, right, with zoning, as you said. Is your office unique, or are there other offices like yours in the rest of the United States?
There's only about, I want to say maybe about a dozen offices of resilience. It is kind of a new thing, and they vary in size and scope of what they do. I know, like the one in West Virginia, I think is all of 2 people. Ours is relatively new. Our neighbor in North Carolina has something very similar, with similar missions having to deal with both disasters and getting ahead of it with resilience and mitigation. But there aren't many of us. But I think it's something that's a trend as people are starting to realize that you just can't do, I'm going to recover from disasters over here and I'm going to mitigate disasters over here. Maybe the 2 ought to be combined so that we're getting a greater return for those 2.
I love it. Yeah, that's great. Okay. So thanks, Ren. Omid, we've been working together on looking at the financing side of investing in resilient housing. So why don't you tell us about your work at IFC and the private sector involvement?
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, and great to see you, Ran and Jonathan. And also, it was great to hear from Marcia the work that the High Commission is doing on resilience. That's really encouraging. The work, as you say, Elizabeth, we have been working together on the program called Building Resilience Index. But before that, I just want to quickly say who we are. We are a part of the IFC, International Finance Corporation. We are the largest development bank, part of the World Bank Group, that is dedicated to private sector development. So we work specifically with private sector. And, in terms of what we have done, we are part of the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, and we have been collaborating on 2 sides on mitigation and resilience. I must say that resilience is a slightly new phenomena for us. We have been trying to explore this area last 3 years on different aspects, but I wanted to just give you high level how we are approaching resilience and adaptation as part of our wider climate goal, and then get into a bit more detail of how we are approaching the housing sector, as you said. In terms of the bigger picture, we have a mandate that from 2025, we have to scan and review every single investment we do everywhere in the world to be Paris aligned. And for Paris alignment, we have 2 elements, building block 1 and building block 2. Building block 1 is looking at the investment that it does not do harm on mitigation side. And building block 2 is to look at that the investment does not have any issue from resilience and adaptation. So these are the 2 elements that we will be screening every single investment that IFC does everywhere on the planet. So that's encouraging because it brings attention to our investment teams to make sure that there is screening happening in very specific and diligent way. That's number 1. And the second one is we also need to increase our investments on resilience and adaptation. We have a target of 35% of our investments in climate, and most of that is now going to mitigation side. And what we are trying to increase adaptation share and resilience share. That is happening in large infrastructure projects like airports or railways or those type of projects. But when it comes to smaller like housing projects, it still needs more work. We are relying a little bit on our work that because we do work with insurance companies and we work with environmental and social reviews, but resilience needs to be highlighted further there. But to do that, what we have been doing, we are looking at the 4-pronged strategy that we have discussed before with you as well, Elizabeth, is around how we can bring financial institutions to play a better role, right? Right now, the banking sector does not really play strong role. The banking is like, there is insurance, and as long as there's insurance, we are okay. We don't really want to get into the game of resilience. However, insurance view of resilience is only 1 year, right? The insurance companies, they insure your property for 1 year, and if something happens within the year, the insurance pulls back. But the banks, we have 10 years, 30 years, 15 years engagement with the property. So we can't really pull out if the insurance pulls out, right? So for banks, it's really critical to bring the banks to understand the value of resilience and how they should differentiate a resilient asset from, as Ron said, for example, from an asset that built on the floor, floodplain, right? So that's number one. The second that is very important for us is the work with governments and provides policy support for different level of policy support, permitting, incentives, and disincentives, right? So when there is issues with an asset, there needs to be ways to pull that asset out or not to permit that asset to be built. And if an asset has better resilience, then what needs to be done to have faster permit or better permitting conditions? On the private sector, we work on education. We have programs for universities with professionals, and we want to increase the skills around resilience. And finally, on tools, we need to make sure that we build tools like Building Resilience Index and educational materials for the construction sector. In terms of the good stories, we have good stories on mitigation. For example, I was in Colombia. We have developed a program on green buildings, and we are now certified more than 95,000 social housing for green buildings. Imagine if we can do the same for resilience and hundreds of thousands of homes to be more resilient. That's one of our targets. We are also having a challenge on self-built housing, and with build change, we are thinking about what to do in the self-built or informal sector, because that's a sector that is much more challenging to deal with from our point of view. We have some programs in India. We are starting with financing self-built housing on green, but on resilience, we are still in process of figuring that out because we do not have a final solution. Obviously, we can collaborate further with our partners and find solutions there. Those are, in a nutshell, the storylines. Happy to explain more as needed.
Yeah, that's great. Congratulations. 95,000 social housing units in Colombia that are certified green. That's pretty impressive. These are new buildings. Yeah, that's great. We could all talk, I think, the whole hour on permitting and the power of incentives or disincentives through the permitting process. So yeah, maybe that's a topic for a special deep dive or something like that. So okay, so I've actually got 2 more questions I was supposed to ask, but I think we're probably not going to have time to get through both of those questions. So I'm going to open it up to you all to decide which you want to answer and what you want to add, because some of you have already touched a bit on the next question. My next question was to ask for some examples of policy and program approaches around resilience in the housing sector that have been showing a lot of promise. And some of you have already touched on those. So if you want to add more on that, go ahead. But then the next question I was about to ask also after that was, what are the greatest bottlenecks in delivering impactful housing policies for the communities that you're working in? So I'm gonna kind of throw those questions out, and my panelists can choose what they want to answer, maybe 3 or 4 minutes each, and then we'll probably have one just single greatest action question at the very end. So why don't I go with Rand first on this next round?
Okay, I'll actually hit both, but I'll be quick. Going back to building codes, Florida just got whacked pretty hard by Hurricane Ian. The community of and I'll probably mispronounce it, Punta Gorda, they actually survived. Their housing survived pretty much intact because they had increased their building codes several years ago. Florida, when after Andrew hit and tore up a bunch of mobile home units, they upped the standards that mobile home units had to be put in Florida. And so that showed over the course of the last couple of hurricanes that their mobile homes did a better job of surviving. So I absolutely think policies that involve increasing, picking where you live, but also those building standards. And the greatest bottleneck, I would say, I'd put it in three things. One, change. People don't like to change. And when you start talking about climate change and building resilient stuff, you get a lot of resistance to that because most of the time they don't understand. But when you break it into simple terms of, hey, we're getting more rain more often and in higher amounts, and where you live, that water's coming through here. So, and when you can show them that, they go, okay, I understand. So there's a resistance issue there. And then the other bottleneck we see is always, it's money. It is all about money. I typically have this much disaster, but I have that much money. And so, getting money to the right things and then effectively and efficiency using it. We throw a lot of money, over $70 billion in the disaster recovery business right now, given by the housing and urban development people in the United States. And, across the board, it's not being used widely and effectively. That's my shot.
And we're all nodding our heads. I think we all agree with you for sure. Meeting people where they are with that simple message is so important. Yeah, that's great. Okay, Omid, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we operate mostly in developing countries, and developing countries are quite complex in a sense that, from the building codes point of view, many of them, they lack building codes, or the building codes are quite outdated. We have countries that the building codes do not exist, or if it exists, it's 30 years old. So it does not really take into account many of the applications. The other challenge is that even if the building code is in place, the process of implementing and checking those building codes do not exist, or there is corruption that they do not really follow the details. When it's, as Ron said, it adds cost, so they try to avoid the cost. So we want to build processes like Building Resilience Index program that would have a second way of verification, so that we have a third party goes there and verifies, that is separate from the normal process of verification and review, and making sure that the change is delivered, right? So because that's really matters. We can have pages of reports, we can have pages of documentations or papers, but if the house is not really strong, the Mother Nature will take that house down, right? So it's really important for us to, when we say something, it's delivered to the end user. And that's where we really want to push the Building Resilience Index to deliver that element. Bottlenecks, I think the bottleneck, the critical bottleneck is international finance. And we have a lot of donors that they really want to support this program. However, the linkage is not happening right now. So we need to just make sure that the stars are aligned, that donors want to do this, banks want to do this, governments want to do this. But for some reason, the dots are not connecting. So we really need to bring everyone to the table and talk through this.
Great. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. I mean, this bringing everyone to the table and then some, I think, is critical. Yeah, next up, Jonathan.
Well, thanks, Omid. You gave me an opportunity to actually mention what I wanted to mention, is that, it's actually about bringing everybody around the table. And, while the Global ABC, started by bringing around the table at the international level, the community, and trying to look at, it was mentioned earlier in the discussion, it's a complex sector with many different actors, many different steps, many processes. And how do you bring all these different people that are involved in this whole process and in the whole value chain together to actually, understand each other and come with a common vision? And so in that context, with the Global ABC, with all Alliance and with our members, we developed some roadmaps towards 2030, 2050, to set a vision for the sector. And in those roadmaps, of course, well, again, you know, we're not looking in isolation at the issue of adaptation or resilience, but it's really also about like, okay, we need to look at the multiple angles and try to have a, I would say, some kind of integrated, holistic approach as much as possible, and as many challenges that it represents also to do that. It's very important to bring all the actors around such a holistic vision. And so what we are doing with the roadmaps is that, you know, we are now working with the countries to build their national roadmap. So based on, you know, what we devised for the regions and for the global level, we said like now we can bring it at the country level so that it's tailored to the realities of the countries. But we really use that more as a process. The objective is not specifically the roadmap. The objective, I would say, is to bring the whole community together to talk to each other and to agree together on what are the priorities and how they can take forward the transformation of the sector. And I mean, we mentioned earlier spatial planning. So those elements are clear elements that are part of the roadmap. One of the first priorities we say you need to look into is urban planning. I mean, and that includes spatial planning overall. And then, of course, the element of resilience is very strongly there also. We mentioned the building codes. And again, there, I think it's very much about how can we drive countries toward like climate zone specific building codes so that actually the climate zones are integrated, because when we talk about adaptation, your building code for, I don't know, the region of the north of India that is in the Himalayas and the south of India, you certainly don't want to have exactly the same building codes. So, you know, that's also very important to integrate those aspects. And then the challenge with the building codes is that as long as they are not mandatory, you know, unfortunately, there is very little progress. And that is something that there's a lot of evidence, I would say, in all the countries of Europe, where, you know, in Europe, it started probably in the 70s, talking about the building codes, but the real progress has actually happened when, and the real, let's say, results happened when the building codes were starting to become mandatory. And so that's a very, you know, big challenge. And Omid mentioned it, it's not only about having building codes, even if they are there, like implementing them, enforcing them, you know, it's a very complex issue, especially for a number of developing countries, even though it's also not that easy in developed countries. So I think it's an overall challenge, but the building codes are certainly a very important lever. And then on the other hand, also, I think it's about, I would say, everything related to thinking about passive approaches, because I mean, when we talk about adaptation, I think, you know, the cooling agenda, in my view, is also an adaptation agenda. The climate is going to get hotter. We need to actually be able to cool our buildings. But we know that we cannot just do mechanical cooling, and there exists quite a number of solutions actually to ensure that we do more on the passive cooling side. And on that angle, we work quite a bit with a coalition, another coalition that we have in UNEP, which is called the Cool Coalition, and where we are actually pushing the whole cooling agenda, including looking at how can you actually avoid as much as possible mechanical cooling, and what can you do, whether it's with nature-based solutions or with better ventilation or shades or these type of things, actually make your buildings more resilient to heat in a sense. So these are some of the key elements. And then as UNEP also, we've been approached by many countries actually that have been hit, for example, by hurricanes. So I mean, Antigua and Barbuda approached us a few years ago saying like, okay, we have a challenge when we have these type of events that hit, is that, you know, our most important services that need to actually be able to operate can't operate anymore because of, you know, the buildings actually not being resilient enough. And, you know, so we have actually started helping them at looking at how can they make their hospitals more resilient, their public like police stations and those type of things more resilient, so that they are still able to operate in these difficult periods. And then also we've helped in Antigua and Barbuda designing a fund actually that helps the how owners of housing or SMEs to actually make their buildings more resilient and resistant to those events possible. And we've also been working on the building codes there specifically. So these are a few examples.
Yeah, which we'd love to share through the Climate Resilient Housing Initiative website. I'd love to read that cool coalition, from my own personal situation here in Colorado, where it gets pretty hot in the summer. Okay, yeah, fantastic. Again, such great, such absolutely fantastic inputs. I think maybe I want to go around and do just this one last question now, right? Which is, what is the single greatest asset or action that would support your organization to advance your goals and ensure you achieve impact quickly, effectively, and equitably? So what is the last thing you want our audience to take away? What is the biggest asset or action you need in order to continue to promote disaster resilient housing? Let's see, I should go in a different order. Omid, how about you going first?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer.
The single one, right? What's the one point?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge I think that the single biggest action would be for the banking sector to act. I mean, we have seen big changes happen after banking sector really came to the game and played. In Colombia, I mentioned the 95,000. Every 5 building that's built in Colombia now, one of them is green certified, and that's amazing. And that happened within 4 years. The housing projects are now, we have many of these housing projects being certified, but the challenge is that how can we then translate this to resilience? And that's where the banking sector, the same way that banking sector played in green, they can play in resilience as well. The second biggest challenge is to find solution for the self-built rural areas. I met with the Minister of Housing in Colombia, and her biggest question was, what can we do with rural areas and self-built housing for resilience and greening? So those are 2 main challenges that we are facing, and hopefully those actions can scale up the resilience.
Well said. Jonathan, what's your single greatest asset or action, or your final point?
And I think that, I will continue making the same point, which is like, about bringing everybody around the table and create the kind of global collective action and radical collaboration, to actually really advance on the issues together. And certainly, certainly more to do on the adaptation and resilience side, So I think on, the mitigation side, there's already quite a bit done. There's a pretty good understanding. There's still a lot that needs to be done overall, I would say. But, most of the countries mention energy efficiency, energy codes in buildings. I mean, this is like something that almost all NDCs of the world now are kind of mentioning. So there is at least a message that went through that, this energy efficiency element is very important. But we don't have it yet for, I would say, the adaptation side. And we don't have it yet also for everything related to the materials and the embodied carbon side. So I think, those are the areas where now we also need to bring the community better behind and make the people understand better. As Ran was saying, it's also a question of, well, people don't really understand the issues sometimes. So it's also really about bringing more evidence and getting the messages clear to them and making them understand, what the consequences can be, what the opportunities are, so that we all get in the right direction. So that would be my final take on that.
Excellent. Well said. Ran, last word to you.
Our greatest asset is people. Look, I'm a dinosaur in the world of resilience and mitigation recovery. My solution to most flooding problems is let's put gray infrastructure, let's put pipe down. I'm fortunate that I'm hiring currently a generation that has grown up that talks resilience, infrastructure, but they talk it in the terms of green infrastructure and solutions that are, they're not limited by the conventional thinking that my generation has grown up with. And so I think the future solution going forward is people, is people who can help people like me to understand what can be done and what is possible and why this is a problem. And I think that is is the greatest asset we have. It's young men and women that are willing to go out there and push the agenda, to get people to the table, to find the intersectionality between all these things like housing and climate change and the talk in terms of adaptation and resilience, and that, as kind of an old guy, I like our hopes for the future because they reside with some really bright women and men that I'm fortunate to work with every day.
Well, I certainly can't top that as a final remark. So thank you for making my concluding remarks very easy, all three of you. So that's just fantastic. I really appreciate all of you and the dynamic interaction that we've had today, as well as the urgency behind some of these remarks, as well as the practicality of how we can move these things forward. So this is just the beginning. I think there's so much more we can do as an entire sector to keep resilient housing on the climate change agenda and to find these practical solutions that make it really scales. So join us, contact us, put your case studies on the Climate Resilient Housing website, come to our next discussions, suggest topics for our next discussions. Let's get the people around the table who can make these changes happen. So absolutely super. We have an event happening in Colombia, which is a hybrid event, virtual and live, on October 25th, highlighting our resilient housing work in Colombia. I believe it's going to be exclusively in Spanish, though. So I need to note that for those of you who are like me and are, unilingual. So please join that. That's going to be put in the chat as well. Again, on resilient housing in Colombia, October 25th. Join us in person in Colombia if you can, but that will be virtual as well. So, and continue accelerating impact. Accelerating action towards COP27. So we will be present at COP27. We're delighted to see this uptick on conversations around loss and damage. And again, resilient housing being on the breakthrough agenda. So I again want to sincerely thank Marcia, Ran, Jonathan, and Omid, and all of you who have joined us today. It's been a great discussion. And I need to hand back to Monica for some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We'll be sharing the recording of the event in case you have any colleagues who missed it or you had to step out for a few minutes. And we'll also have the opportunity to sign up for our soon-to-be launched newsletter for climate resilient housing. So if you have any case studies to contribute, if you'd like to be a part of this campaign, please contact us at advocacy@buildchange.org to learn more about opportunities to engage with us in the future. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Take